Mariana and Albert Peterson lived at the family estate in Oakport, but what was at first a refuge slowly over several years became a prison. Of course it was not, but it felt that way. Mariana could not really feel comfortable in the Peterson household. Her mannerisms and tone of voice sometimes elicited in others slight reactions that she in turn felt hurt by. Usually others' friendliness overcame her resentment, but over time estrangement grew, and inevitably that included her feelings towards Albert. As much as he loved her, he could not help but love his family, and eventually she took that as betrayal. What solidified the estrangement was his refusal to move to Boston at her request. She did not beg, but soon moved into a spare bedroom and, so to speak, formalized estrangement and separation. Their son was 3 at the time, and in spite of Albert's pleading and expressions of love, she reverted to formality and refused his pleas to move back. But for the sake of his son, he kept most of his hurt to himself. George grew up well loved by his aunts, grandparents, servants, and of course by his mother and father. To him, their relationship was de facto normal, and in fact the situation encouraged his being taken care of by the extended family. His mother was alternately very loving and a little distant, but he barely noticed because she made sure someone else was paying attention to him. She was absent the house fairly often. Once a week she visited Boston, but most days she had lunch and spent some time in Oakport. She had friends in town. The estate families were a natural aristocracy. That, plus her beauty and charisma, the estate families were a natural aristocracy. That, plus her beauty and charisma, meant that anyone she deigned to like was her friend. Thus her ambiguous state of marriage allowed her to have male friends who might imagine themselves to be subtly hopeful. But since everybody was necessarily proper, nothing ever needed to be said. So in town, Mariana felt appreciated in a way she did not within the Peterson household. Nonetheless, after some adjustment, friendliness and goodwill were mostly maintained. Albert had the hardest time adjusting to the situation. Although he increased the amount he drank, it was not so much as to prevent him from increasing the amount of time devoted to business. Although the family's wealth was derived from mostly passive part ownership in Oakport Manufacturing Company, which was really a holding company that owned other corporations, Albert began to build his own business empire. The Depression was not yet over. Investment opportunities were relatively cheap, and although revenues were still modest, that would change in a few years when America went to war. Although about 500,000 Americans paid the ultimate sacrifice in World War II, many Americans reaped an increase in prosperity from the whirlwind that destroyed so many millions in so much of the world. So while many nations were rebuilding from the ruins, America became the wealthiest nation on the planet. And some Americans became extremely wealthy. Albert Peterson was one of them. And as he grew older, his hedonism increased, his fortune did not decrease, and eventually George inherited it. Albert died of a delayed broken heart in 1974. Mariana asked for a divorce in 1952 when George went off to college. She moved back to Boston and quickly and quietly remarried. Until then, Albert always had a faint hope of reconciliation. But also he enjoyed her presence in the household and their limited relationship. But recurring grief turned into a torrent at the divorce. His depression would have become all-consuming if he did not do something, and that something was move to Manhattan and immerse himself in everything he could, both business and culture, especially theater, which eventually became producing off-Broadway plays, usually at a loss, which he could afford, but which quickly made him very sought after in the theater world. And that attention by many was a partial healing. His business interests were many, but real estate development was especially financially rewarding. Manhattan was growing fast. In spite of background depression, he was enjoying his life, but he never remarried. The grief seemed to surge if he even considered getting too serious with anyone. But he had women friends who understood him. To some weird extent, George Peterson followed his father. George's marriage fell apart after only a few years, but before they had any children, so they divorced quickly. But George was heartbroken and his grief was intolerable. He escaped by traveling overseas, and he kept traveling for 15 years. Albert had set up a trust fund for him when he was 18 and kept adding to it over the years. Although George graduated college, he barely knew how to make it in the world. There was no home to come home to after his parents left Oakport. He rented an apartment in town when he went back to college. He rented an apartment in town when he went to college and stayed there during holidays. He felt abandoned to some extent. After he graduated, he stayed there for want of a plan. Instead of getting a job, he just continued to take a couple courses each semester and did a lot of reading. He had friends. He hung out at a couple bars and cafes. He was easygoing and just a little cool without any pretentiousness. It was not too surprising that a young woman fell in love with him, and they got married soon after. George soaked up love with strong desire. His joy during that first year was intense, but that had its dark side, which was jealousy. His stated concerns were not rational, and Laura became upset at his suspicions and the need to reassure him. But the stress and resentment dissipated. The love she once felt was boundless. After a while, she just started yelling at him. It was over. He realized that and hated himself. He felt cursed. His life was repeating his father's experience. There was a Peterson curse. George was not that rational. He was a romantic. He read books. He drank strong coffee and strong beer. He smoked herb. A beautiful woman could melt his heart, and loving too much could break it. That grief delivered him into despair, but despair broke his caution. It gave him a kind of courage, the courage to explore the unknown and to travel, to roam the cities of Europe, to forget what was broken in a college town in America, to try and forget Laura. George inherited the Oakport estate after he was beginning to get tired of traveling. Although he had all the money he needed, he felt hopeless, but did not feel it was possible to settle anywhere. The Oakport estate was once his home, but then it was full of family. It had been mostly abandoned since his grandparents passed on. The extended family was dispersed, and almost no one used it for vacation. Thus, although hesitant, George decided to make it his home. He was afraid loneliness and depression would catch up with him there, but he was tired and needed a place to rest. He had one ambition that the house would be useful for: accumulating a personal library, and reading would more than compensate for his relative solitude. But collecting would not stop at books, furniture, artwork, ceramics, eventually renovations. The estate was his responsibility as well as his home. He made friends in town and had catered dinner parties. After a few years, his life was full. Much time he was reading or in contemplation. In Europe, he discovered some spiritual awareness.